Hi, everyone. For those joining, we're going to wait another minute for more people to come in, and then we'll get started. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. We're going to get started. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Institute for Policy Studies, I want to begin by thanking our co-sponsor organizations, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the Project on Government Oversight, Public Citizen, Code Pink, and the Pentagon Budget Campaign for co-sponsoring today's book talk. If you're here today, you're among those who recognize that what we know as national security is more often a question of a local jobs program. The power of the Pentagon as the jobs program is hard to understate. Miriam Pemberton's book, 6 Stops on the National Security Tour, travels from Johnstown, Pennsylvania to Arkansas to Southern California, shows how all of these diverse places come to rely on military spending as a jobs program. When it comes to the Pentagon as a jobs program, Miriam is the leading expert, and this book is her tour de force. Miriam Pemberton is a research fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and former director of the National Commission for Economic Conversion and Disarmament. Her prior work includes 2 report series on rebalancing security spending, military versus climate security, and a unified security budget for the United States. I'm especially fond of Miriam because in her previous role on the board of the National Priorities Project, where I work, she was responsible for being the matchmaker who brought National Priorities Project into the Institute for Policy Studies, which has been the best thing to happen to NPP probably ever. So many thanks to Miriam. We will begin by hearing from her about her book, followed by questions from our panel, and then we'll take audience questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please click and type your questions there, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Thanks for joining us, and Miriam, take it away. Miriam, we can't hear you. All right, one little short moment of technical difficulties.
How's that? Is that better?
All right. Thanks.
All right. Sorry. Anyway, it's hot and it's August, and so I am really grateful for all of you for being here. So this panel had sort of posed two questions. One was, whatever happened to the peace dividend, and the other, can we get one back? So the answer to the first question is that there are essentially two ingredients to demilitarizing an economy. One is to cut military spending, and the other is to have an industrial policy that effectively steers the economy toward non-military production. So in the post-Cold War period, we definitely had the first. We got a cut over 5 years of 1/3 of the military budget and 2/3 of the procurement budget. There was a conversion program that was had many parts to it. When Bill Clinton was giving his victory speech when he won the election in '92, he said, we are going to convert our US economy from a military giant to a domestic giant. So in this program, there were funds for worker retraining, for community transition planning. There was a small program that gave loan guarantees to small and medium-sized contractors to convert. There was a pretty substantial investment in commercial shipbuilding. And there was their flagship program was called the Technology Reinvestment Project, and it funded consortia of defense companies and commercial companies and academia and the national labs and various other actors, including theoretically unions and nonprofits, to work together to commercialize defense technology. And some of them did succeed. There were basically two problems with the Clinton administration conversion program. And one was, Bill Clinton's sort of have your cake and eat it too love affair with the idea of dual use technology. So we found that 80% of these grants in this technology reinvestment project went to dual use projects, that is companies straddling military production and civilian production. So it kind of prevented these companies from really getting a solid foothold in the civilian sector. The other big problem was that most of the defense savings, almost 80%, went to deficit reduction. So, what economists call demand pull, from one sector to another sector was kind of too diluted to really succeed and overcome the resistance of defense contractors to, hunker down and keep doing what they were doing. There were some other factors. Well, it didn't help that the Republicans took over the legislature in '94, and contractors began to say, yes, we'll convert. We're going to convert by beefing up our arms exports overseas. That's the conversion program. And then there was Colin Powell, who on the one hand said, we are running out of enemies. And on the other hand said, we need to build up multiple layers of military dominance to prevent, any pretender to the role of, sole superpower from emerging. And of course, the contractors did their part in thwarting the peace dividend by beefing up all the, strategies that we know very well, the campaign contributions, the larger lobbying staffs, the revolving door, and they kind of doubled down on the strategy of spreading contracts in as many congressional districts as they possibly could. This is obviously not a method of, improving industrial efficiency. It is a way of building political protection, which they have done. So a couple of years ago, I decided to kind of go and explore, as Lindsay said, 6 defense-dependent communities around the country, and I picked them from all different sectors. And the publisher wanted me to do a chapter on kind of new developments, the militarization of the border, and the hyper weapons of the future. And so I did a chapter on them. But I went to, for example, Connecticut, which is one of the most defense-dependent states in the country. I also went to California, which certainly has more military spending in it, lifting up its economy than Connecticut, but it's a much larger economy, and so it's less dependent on military spending. And then there was a chapter on this kind of Rust Belt town that in Pennsylvania, and its congressman used his position as chair of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee to essentially, with earmarks and quid pro quos, to build up this military industry to take the place of their steel economy. And this kind of worked for a while, and then he died, and then most of it just collapsed. I also went to this backwater town in Arkansas, where there is a base that is kind of, that builds their economy around chemical weapons. And then came the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they mostly went out of business. I went to Los Alamos for obvious reasons, and I went to Binghamton, New York, and that's my great example showing that conversion actually can work. I found a former defense engineer at the plant. It was helpful he was former. I had a horrible time getting people within these companies to actually talk to me, but this guy had retired, so he was a little nervous, but he was a little more willing to talk to me, and he was willing to explain how he managed to take the hydraulic system from an F-15 fighter jet and turn it into a hybrid electric bus that is now on streets around the world. Just got introduced into Houston and Philadelphia. So I want to especially mention California, because during this period and before and after and now, they developed what I think is the strongest model for a green industrial policy. And specifically, because the aerospace industry in Southern California took just about the biggest hit of any community around the country during the post-Cold War period, they really did the most to connect the demilitarization challenge to the challenge to prevent climate change. So California commissioned these reports connecting 3 big dots. First, California's groundbreaking emissions standards and regulations, and a collapsing aerospace industry, and California's famous love affair with their cars. And they provided various kinds of assistance that really weren't given anywhere else in the country to help this conversion to a green industrial policy to emerge. In the book, I look at one of the projects that Southern California put into place, and it was a project to retrain laid off aerospace workers to build electric cars. Lockheed Martin had created this enormous PR debacle by shutting down a plant in Burbank and laying off all the workers after promising that it would never do any such thing. And the union representative, heard the news on his way to work that this was happening kind of tomorrow. So they had this big PR problem. And so they donated one of the facilities that they were shutting down to this project to retrain aerospace workers for the electric car industry. They developed a prototype. It, led off the Grand Prix, some Grand Prix race somewhere. It got a lot of media attention, and politicians were excited. Long story short, consumers weren't really ready for electric cars, and the car manufacturers certainly weren't ready, and the defense contractors kind of embraced it in public and worked to behind the scenes to kill it. So now consumers and car manufacturers, are ready, and the need for a decarbonized economy could hardly be clearer. So now to the second question, where are we now with these conditions necessary to achieve a new peace dividend? So I feel like I'm talking now to the people who are working with creativity and determination to get the military budget cut. And they are working against probably the worst headwinds we've had on that issue since 9/11. I'm kind of holding my breath to see if the so-called Inflation Reduction Act actually passes. It certainly has many defects, but it will provide the kit. If it passes, it has the potential to provide the conditions that the post-Cold War era didn't have, among other things, replacing manufacturing the internal combustion engine with electric vehicles. So as a third condition, I think we should try to figure out how, as they tried in California, to really connect these two challenges, an industrial policy focused on the climate crisis and demilitarization. So I have an idea or two to throw out on that score, but I don't know if I've talked too long, and maybe we should get into the discussion.
Go ahead. Want to throw out the ideas, and then we'll move into the discussion.
Okay. So I'm sort of fixated at the moment on the Defense Production Act. I mean, I was thinking about Bill McKibben, who wrote that, mainly what the climate movement is doing and needs to do is to say in all sorts of ways, this is not normal. And so I think, revealing how and focusing on how abnormal it is to have a military establishment that gets Congress to vote year after year for weapon systems that the Pentagon doesn't even need. And this in the midst of this clear threat to national security that has been neglected, which is climate change. So our budgets have been structured around kind of both and, we can jack up the defense budget as long as we jack up the domestic budget, that kind of thing, or we have to cut them both equally, whatever, but that's not what's happening now. So it seems to me the Defense Production Act sort of says that's not what this is about. This policy is different. It says that there's a national security emergency that we're not focusing on, and we need to divert production from one to the other. And so, you know, an industrial policy to do that. Industrial policy has been, you know, taboo in America for so long. And I think that taboo is beginning to weaken. I think this Semiconductor Act was part of it. And the Defense Production Act is an industrial policy that directs a shift from military to civilian production in the national interest. And so I think it can be a vehicle, could be, for, you know, examining the meaning of national security, arguing for a shift in production, and saying that this national emergency justifies government to steer production toward responding to it, you know, as they did in World War II. And so I think this is a potentially potent vehicle for our case. And so I'd like to spend some time kind of digging into some of these examples of the Defense Production Act in operation, you know, finding out how it all works, and then using it to make the case for, you know, using this tool to shift production toward this climate crisis that we're in. The Defense Production Act is included in the Inflation Adjustment Act, about $500 million for heat pumps and, you know, these minerals that are needed for the current iteration of electric batteries. You know, very small investment. And so I think lifting that up would be one way to kind of connect the climate crisis to the demilitarization effort, and show that they are intimately related and they need to be. So, you know, I think pushing this is one way forward for us. Just my 2 cents.
Thanks, Miriam. Tremendously helpful. And for folks who haven't read the book or have bought it and have started it, I highly encourage you to read it. Miriam's travel around the country to these different places, and her discussion with people who are on the ground, with business leaders, with workers, with union leaders, with you know, former congressional staffers and everything. It really lays all of this out in a much clearer way than you can get even from just knowing that we have, say, a military industrial complex, or knowing that a lot of these programs keep being funded by Congress, despite the fact that they're not needed for national security, just because of the economics. So it's a tremendously enlightening book. It's also a hopeful book. You know, this is something where we've been fighting, lots of people have been fighting for a long time, and right at this very moment, it's a very difficult fight. But Miriam's book, I think, really lays out cases where things have moved forward, there has been progress, and that's incredibly important for us to remember right now, that is possible. So I'm going to move into questions from our panelists. And audience questions. We have some audience members who are entering questions. I'm just going to say again that if you want to ask a question, please type it. There's a little Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Click on that, type your question in the chat, and we'll get to audience questions after the panel questions. So first on our panel, Diana Olbaum is Senior Strategist and Legislative Director for Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Diana, what would you ask Miriam?
Thank you so much, Lindsay, and congratulations, Miriam, on this amazing book. And I hope, before I ask my question, I can just say a few words of praise for this book, because let me start off, I was blown away by how exhaustively researched this book is, and how cogently it weaves together so many different ways in which the military-industrial complex is lodged in our society, our economy, and our political life. And Miriam has literally mapped the geography of militarism, like taking it from being one of these fairly nebulous and theoretical constructs to its real tangible impact on ordinary American life. And I think what Miriam researches and explains so beautifully, and I would say tragically, is that the ideas and the know-how for a different way of being are out there. They're known. We have examples and experience of solutions that work. It's the political will that's missing. And I would say that political will is missing because our entire political and economic system is invested in the continuation of the military-industrial complex. So the real question for me is, where do you start unraveling it? How do you break this vicious cycle? There's one spot in the book where it's in the conclusion where Miriam chastises the Biden administration because instead of shifting from a militarized industrial policy toward a civilian one, they've merely added one on top of another, which is something that she mentioned just now. But honestly, I don't know how we get out of this vicious cycle if we don't first create the alternative way of doing things and then taper off the old way. Because how do you convince workers to leave good paying, secure, and often unionized jobs in the military sector for ones in clean energy that may not really exist yet? How do you convince members of Congress to stop taking money from the defense industry when they need to raise upwards of $10 million every 2 years to get reelected? And how do you convince ordinary Americans that despite everything our culture and political ideology tells them, that seeking to dominate the world militarily does not make us or anyone else safer? And in fact, it causes real harm to so many of us, especially Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Muslim, and other people of color. So I'll put that all together. Miriam, how and where do you think we can start loosening the grip of the military-industrial complex?
Well, that was a beautiful sort of picture of the problem. And, you know, I don't think I can answer all those questions. I guess I'll go back to what I was just talking about. I'm sort of pinning my hopes on connecting this to the climate crisis. I think that's a way to bring young people into our movement. And, you know, it's a connection to, you know, a clear national security problem. Even, you know, the military says this is a growing and urgent threat. And it's also, you know, unlike some parts of what we need the money to go to, healthcare and education and all, this, you know, the climate challenge requires technology. It requires, you know, some high tech development. It requires, you know, workers who, you know, have skills in machining and, you know, a range of other skills. And so, you know, that to me is, you know, the focal point. In terms of workers, I just want to mention, I mean, you know, it's true, as Lindsay said, you know, this is marketed as a jobs program. But there was, you know, this is anecdotal, but there was, well, there's an air base north of Los Angeles called, in the city of Palmdale, Plant 42, colorfully named. And it's the only place in the country where 3 of the big primes, Lockheed, Northrop, and Boeing, are all sitting there together on one base. But there's also there on the base a Japanese company that sort of snuck in when there was a bit of a downturn and they had some space. And so, so they let this Japanese company come in. And so they make light rail cars to supply Los Angeles. And I happened to see on a website called Indeed.com, this jobs listing website, a posting from a worker at this plant. It's called Koshgarian, making the light rail cars. And this worker said, good pay. Sometimes you have to work maybe a bit more than 8 hours, but the work is important, and it supports my community and other communities around the world, and so that's why I do it. So it's certainly true that military producers can pay fat wage rates with Pentagon spending, but it was lovely to me to see this one worker who wanted to be paid well, but once that's satisfied, then what he really wanted was a sense of purpose and a sense that he was doing something for his community. So that was kind of that was heartening, I guess. This is far from a comprehensive answer to your comprehensive question, but I guess I'd come back again to what I see is this opportunity we have to connect this issue to the climate crisis, and that's sort of where I'm focusing on.
Thanks, Miriam. Our next question will be from Rob Weissman, who is the president of Public Citizen, which over the last couple of years has spearheaded the People Over Pentagon Coalition, which brings together climate groups and immigration groups and peace groups and progressive groups and all kinds of other organizations to work on cutting Pentagon spending. Rob, what would you like to ask Miriam?
Well, I'm going to follow Diana's example and first say a word about the book. And I wanted to just build on and amplify what you said, Lindsay, and what Diana mentioned, and with one different direction. So you, Lindsay, properly said this book is, you get it? Is a tour de force. And Diana talked about how deep the research is, which is true. And I'm worried that people listening are hearing that and thinking this book is a tomb and it must be really important, but maybe it's really hard to get through and boring. And I want to amplify by saying it is not hard to get through and it's not boring. It's a storytelling book, as you were describing about going to these different communities. And it's not just informative and incisive and sharing of the information that you all have described and that Miriam, you've been articulating. It's just an easy and great read. So that's a huge endorsement. Please, if you don't have this book, get this book. Now to the question. I think, well, one more comment as a setup for the question. And I agree with, I think, remark that Lindsay made, that sort of reading these stories of looking at the, as you're telling the tale, Miriam, of these really Pentagon-dependent communities that have constructed their local economies, often out of desperation, around military contracting, you kind of really see the political problem we have, as you illustrate, in moving towards just holding steady, let alone cutting Pentagon spending, because the members of Congress, in addition to the money they get, in addition to lobbying, they're just kind of reflecting where their communities are, and they don't want to cost jobs in their communities, especially when it's, as many of them are, as you point out, pretty economically strapped places apart from the military contracting. So I mean, just as a comment, I think all of us who work in this space and people who just follow these issues know that, but your reporting in this book kind of gives a richness to the story, and that just, I think, really makes clear the challenge. Now, so as you're describing, what do we do? You're saying, well, we can have this sort of alternative climate industrial policy. We can offer an alternative and wean ourselves off the Pentagon contracting system. I wanted to ask a question that was a little bit more micro than that. As you're thinking about, I think as you look at these communities, in the book, which are so heavily Pentagon dependent, it's really clear like, this is going to be really hard in these places. But also, as you describe, I think even in the first chapter, there's a lot, the defense contractors spread their business throughout the country, but most places don't have the intensity of the towns and communities that you've looked at. And so actually moving away from the book for a second, but in your sort of traveling across the land, do you see possibilities for organizing that looks a little different and a little easier in places that aren't so centrally dependent? And is there a sort of a pathway for us to do organizing in those communities to maybe offset this just really stiff problem we're going to have in the towns that maybe are very heavily reliant on Pentagon contracting?
I'm a slow thinker, and I would love to give that more thought, and I haven't really developed a kind of a program for how to do that, I guess.
Okay, let me amend the question to what you focused on in these towns. Do you see? I mean, to me, that seems like it's a little bit. These problems are like chicken and egg in terms of sort of dealing with the facts on the ground and changing the politics. Like the facts on the ground make it hard to change the politics. But if you change the politics, how are we going to change the facts on the ground? As in the course of these travels into these communities, where are the openings you see politically, apart from just sort of saying, let's give a whole new economic model? What are the ways that people have been open to thinking about alternative pathways for their economic development?
There's an Office of Economic Adjustment in the Pentagon, which works on, which has in the past worked on giving planning grants to communities that have had a major contract cancellation or a base closure. The idea is to bring together all the stakeholders and, figure out how we can develop, a sectoral strategy to develop other forms of economic development in the town. And it was always a problem that this was in the Pentagon, and, the defense hawks said, what in the world is this thing doing in the Pentagon? Always a target on its back. And so now it's changed its name. It's now the Office of Local, rather than Office of Economic Adjustment, it's the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. And so, let's keep them all in the fold. I guess I'd say in terms of, promising developments. So in the infrastructure bill, there is a set of grants they're going to give. I mean, the money is there, and they're going to be giving it out to 20 or 30 communities around the country to develop these manufacturing hubs. And so in my example of Binghamton, New York, where, a major contractor did succeed in converting some of its production, they are angling for a $100 million grant, and they're pretty confident about it, whatever that means, to take the campus, so-called, where BAE is making, its military stuff and these buses, and turn it into a clean energy manufacturing hub. And so, somewhat unfortunately, they're really focused on lithium batteries. And our beloved John Cavanagh has made very clear why, and all of the environmental movement has made very clear why we need to find alternatives to that. And parenthetically, back in the post-Cold War period, there was an effort to look at the national labs. The Secretary of Energy had a commission you know, we don't need nuclear weapons anymore. So they thought at that time. And, you know, so what are these national labs going to do? And so the commission was unfortunately headed by the head of Motorola. And, you know, in the end, they thought about some changes around the edges, but basically the labs had to keep doing their important nuclear work. And you know, their main idea for how to transform the labs would be to privatize them, you know. But my contention is that if the national labs had really started to work on alternatives to, you know, battery technology that comes from mining that pollutes the groundwater, we would have a range of batteries that we don't have now, and wouldn't be, you know, depending on this mining. So that's what's happening in Binghamton. They're trying to, this professor at the University of Binghamton has been working on lithium batteries for, you know, decades, and so he is spearheading this effort. And the idea of this and other of these manufacturing hubs, which have been around since the Obama administration, but, you know, a little too dual use for my taste. And we'll see what happens with the Biden administration when they do get around to giving out these grants. But the basic idea is create some places in communities that can then be kind of anchors for other, you know, other manufacturers to come in and, you know, supply different elements for this big push on you know, electric batteries. And, you know, to me, it has the potential, at least, of becoming a way of, you know, taking communities, you know, they're going to favor communities that are struggling more than others, I think. And, you know, building up a base and expanding it of, you know, kind of critical national problems. And I think it's pretty clear what critical national problem I want them to work on, but we'll see.
Thanks, Miriam. Our next question is going to be from Jeff Wilson, who's the director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight.
Thanks, Lindsay, and thanks, Miriam. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this. You hit on something that I think is just so important here, that this issue, both in terms of BRAC, you know, base realignment and closure issues, but also the defense industrial base, is so vast, and by design is sort of diffused throughout lots of different communities. You know, defense budget is the largest piece of discretionary spending in the United States budget, and I think that for lots of reasons have realized that if they can sort of diffuse it to as many constituencies as possible, that makes the programs flow a lot better. And I'm kind of reminded of this classic story that one piece of the B-1 bomber was built in every state in lower 48, you know, and that was kind of looked at as a joke when I was coming up in the industry. And now I think that that's even more endemic. And I think that these programs are even more diffused to even more constituencies out there.
Lockheed, you know, brags on their website about how the F-35 is built in 45 states. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they're a part of everything. When I was a congressional intern way back, on my first day learning how to, you know, send constituent email, I was blown away that the software that we used was designed by Lockheed Martin. You know, like there's these things sort of get into all areas of our democracy, but on these issues specifically, you know, both my wife and I come from Department of Defense citadels. I grew up right next to the 1st Marine Division in Southern California. She grew up next to the Air Force Academy in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. And both of those institutions have left sort of indelible impressions on the communities around them, both for good, you know, reasons and bad. We had a lot of pride in our community because of the Marines that were there. But they were also sort of big enough economies to have more than just the military as their sole reason for existing. But that's obviously not always the case. And there are many cities and towns and economies in this country that have boiled down to just a military support economy or just a military production economy. And where the annual military budget is really the only jobs program in town, right? And the only jobs program for that constituency. And unfortunately, like you talked about in your opening, we know that that is not the most effective way to run a military. This thing that's supposed to be sort of a meritocracy, results-oriented sort of enterprise. And there are plenty of big budget weapons and operations that stay in the annual defense budget every year because they are essential to some communities' livelihoods. And I'm thinking here for me, coming from the nuclear weapons portfolio of like the ICBM caucus in Congress, right? Where it's impossible for us to reduce the number of deployed ICBMs below 400 now, regardless of strategic posture or if we have better technology or if the Navy is going to deploy more submarines or if we have more arms control agreements, because those bases are really important to the communities in Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, and South Dakota, regardless of anything that strategy might have to do with it. So I'm curious, how you think we can work to disassociate these two things from one another. Is there a world where we can find other economies for these communities? I think that you've already picked out Southern California as an interesting example there, and allow us to make smart and accountable choices about the way that we spend money on military programs, because it seemingly the budget only goes up every single year. And how are we going to be able to help some of these smaller communities sort of transition away from this kind of predatory way that we spend money on the military and deal with the politics of that?
Yeah, so I would say my experience doing this research confirms everything you're saying and have lived with in your own experience. I'm thinking of the base that I visited in the poorest quadrant of one of the poorest states in the country, Arkansas. So that base got started to build the production facilities for chemical weapons during World War II. And then, that mission stayed around and the community was really built up around it. And then comes the Chemical Weapons Convention. And, so now what do we do? The base, they've tried desperately to keep the base open, and so far they have, but it's been vastly, diminished. And, so I would talk to people in this town of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, about this. It's an arsenal. And over I would hear, you're not going to say anything bad about the base, right? You're not going to say anything like that. So they are hanging on with kind of dribs and drabs, and they make hazmat suits and so forth. So I mentioned there is this federal money, coming out of the Pentagon, but its purpose has been clearly marked as not economic transition, but keeping these communities tightly knit to the Pentagon. There are, I think some more promising entities. The Economic Development Administration in the Commerce Department has these, economic transition planning grants. And they've been vastly underfunded compared to what the Pentagon had. But, there's some effort to build those up. And I think if we get serious about this, we can really tailor some of those grants to communities that are facing specifically the demilitarization challenge. So in Pine Bluff, the what seems like their best opportunity to move beyond, got to hang on to this base for, with everything we've got. Next to the base is a huge facility called the National Center for Toxicological Research. And this is the only FDA facility outside of Washington. What's it doing there in this, poor section of Arkansas? And the answer is that it was the lab that was built in World War II to create all these new chemical weapons designs. And then Richard Nixon, oddly, I can talk about why, but he decided to convert this to be part of the FDA and look at sort of cancer-causing chemicals and other chemicals in the U.S. environment that are potentially hurting us all. And so there have been efforts to kind of develop a biotech sector around, built around this National Toxicological Research Center. And, there haven't been too many successes there. I think, one of the problems that you're kind of alluding to is that in places that don't have, much going for them, it's really hard to do. So in Pine Bluff, I'd be there. It would take me 20 minutes to dial up the internet. They don't have, any good rail lines anymore, any ports anymore. So, so out in the middle of nowhere, which is where a lot of these bases are, it's really hard to do this. Now in places that are more urban areas, it's very possible to convert bases into vibrant parts of the economic development landscape. Think of the Presidio in San Francisco area, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. It took them a long time, but now they have more jobs there than they ever had when it was a base. Brunswick Naval Air Station is another. So it's a lot easier to do in certain areas of the country than in other areas. And I think you were really describing the big boulder that all of us in one way or another are trying to move, which is how to make our decisions on how much we spend on the military and what we make really derived from an honest assessment of a strategy and national security need. And that's not what we have right now. So again, I'm pinning my hopes on climate change to be the game changer, I hope.
Thanks, Miriam.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Miriam. And our final panelist question is from Jody Evans, the co-founder of Code Pink. And Jody, what's your question for Miriam?
So many of my questions have been asked. Well, thank you, Lindsay, for hosting this. And Miriam, just girlfriend, thank you so much for all you gave to write this brilliant and compelling book, and all your years of study and work to articulate this huge problem of militarism embedded in our communities. It's, for us at Code Pink, it's so deeply needed, and we love you and appreciate you. So especially, we're just about to launch a new campaign to cancel the F-35, using it to raise up the costs and the greed of weapons building. And we have activists in Burlington, Vermont and Madison, Wisconsin, and they're building a strong force, so we're super excited. But we feel at Code Pink that change and peace start locally and in our culture, and you address this so well in your book. And you've talked about how the weapons industry manipulates and buys Congress. And then when talking about Pine Bluff, it sounds like they do the same locally and even have the funds to do that, which is criminal. But what did you learn about how peace activists can engage locally to highlight the costs of war? You talk about the planet being a place where the pivot can happen, but is there any conversation about what is real security in contrast to what is being sold as the benefits of having the war industry in their community? You mentioned the high-paying jobs, but you know, there's not like a lot of jobs. And also that guy that says, you know, I'm doing something good. Do you see any opening to address the people's needs at home? You know, that real security is housing and healthcare and education and support for healthy communities.
Yeah.
How does the war machine derive power locally to sustain their presence in the face of, you know, the really ripping of the fabric of society that's started with the war on terror? You know, the costs of war to people and planet are so high. How do we better tell that story, that our future depends on peace, both for planet and the people? And how does that worker think that working for peace is better than working for more death and destruction?
Yeah, yeah. Great question. They all are. So one of the things I tried to do in the book was look at what I call the prosperity gospel of military spending, the idea that you throw a lot of money, military money into a community and it will thrive. But what I found on this tour was that in place after place, you know, the military had thrown a lot of money there and, you know, create a lot of jobs. And as we know from Heidi Peltier's wonderful work that I originally commissioned her first study, by the way. You know, beyond that, you know, what can we say to sort of poke holes in this prosperity gospel of military spending? And so, as I say, in place after place, I found a lot of military money, but the community as a whole is not in good shape. So for example, Los Alamos, where Los Alamos County makes the Forbes magazine top 10 per capita income list, you know, year after year. But the adjacent county at the bottom of this mesa where Los Alamos is, Rio Arriba County struggles with a reputation as the heroin capital of the country and has one of the lowest per capita incomes in the United States. And then in this place I mentioned, Palmdale, California, where Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop are all there together. You know, so massive amounts of military spending. But I interviewed the economic development director of Palmdale, and he ruefully referred to his town's reputation as a basket case. So, you know, example after example. So these are all anecdotal. So what I did was I looked at the top 3 most defense-dependent counties in the top 20 most defense-dependent states. And I, you know, compared, you know, that side of things, their defense dependency to the poverty rates. And what I found was that in nearly half of the cases, the towns where all this military, the most military money has gone, these communities either match or exceed the national average, national poverty average. And so what I'm hoping is that this, and actually a colleague of mine has suggested other ways I might want to kind of deepen that analysis and extend it and all. But what I'm hoping is that it will be, you know, a tool for activists to use to, you know, look at their own communities, do this kind of analysis. It's really simple. If I can do it, anybody can do it. And, you know, and then have another tool to raise questions about this prosperity gospel of military spending.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. And thanks to the panel for a really rich discussion. I just want to emphasize that everyone on this panel is working day in and day out to solve this problem of Pentagon spending and the Pentagon absorbing so many of the resources of this country. I also want to recognize in the audience today, there are many names who I recognize as also working day in and day out for that same purpose. So we are almost out of time. I'm going to give Miriam just one audience question that I'm going to challenge her to answer quickly, and then we'll see if the panelists have any final words they'd like to share. So Miriam, here's the question. Is there a base closure commission? In Orlando, we closed the Naval Training Center 20 years ago. Baldwin Park in its place is now highly successful there. Can this be replicated elsewhere?
There is theoretically a base closure commission, but Congress does not want it to close any more bases, despite the fact that the Pentagon says, I believe the last figure was, we have 30% excess capacity in the base structure, even by the Pentagon's standards. But there hasn't been a BRAC, a Base Realignment and Closure Commission, since the year 2005. Congress just, clings to these things and wants to keep them open. However, there is, this money for community reuse planning, now called, the Defense Cooperation Agency, that has money for communities to look at their bases and come together to find alternative uses. Even if the base hasn't closed, but I guess you said your base had closed. So one thing I did a few years ago was I got a little money from our beloved Colum Foundation to fund activists in 5 different states to try to use this money to sort of democratize this process. It's often dominated by the inside players, so I guess what I would suggest to you would be, try to see whether your local officials would be interested in applying for this planning grant money, and then working really hard to make sure they are truly democratic processes, that they are not controlled by the insiders, but that all the stakeholders are at the table to try to figure out something else to do with your base to improve the economic health of your community.
Thanks, Miriam. And I misspoke. We have another almost 30 minutes. So we're going to do more audience questions until we go. That's what I get for having a window partially covering the time on my computer screen. So the next audience question from Janet Weil is, I serve on the Veterans for Peace Climate Crisis and Militarism Project, and we've shown a slideshow to 75 groups so far all over the US. What should we include in our slideshow about economic conversion? What's the main takeaway that we can link to the climate crisis?
Wow, that's great. I think I need to do some talking points for this book, and so when I do, maybe you could use some of those. I think sort of one takeaway, we didn't really talk about this chapter that's devoted to this conversion example. Norman Augustine, who was the head of Lockheed Martin, gave it this tagline, conversion has a record unblemished by success. And under his nose, he was, this facility in Binghamton was, proving that tagline wrong by, by figuring out how to do it. So it's not true that conversion has no record of success. It's not happening because, with defense budgets high, nobody wants to do it. But it can be done, and it is being done, but it's only in sort of small pockets. And to make this thing go national, you know, there need to be military cuts, and there need to be you know, a change in industrial policy. And again, you know, I think the climate crisis is our moment. So I'm so happy you're making that connection. That's you know, to me, the linchpin of potential success for our effort.
Thanks, Miriam. And I do want to invite the rest of our panelists to weigh in on these questions as well, if they have anything to add. For now, we'll move on to the next question. John Raby says, Miriam's suggestions makes a great deal of sense. While we know how to convert to civilian-based industrial policy and programs, how do we bring around public and congressional opinion to make it happen? And then as a follow-up, how do we burst the balloon of the militarized popular culture? Case in point, I went to see Top Gun to see how the audience would react. They clapped and cheered as the film ended.
Yeah, you know, I would say on that question, our other panelists would have as much to say about it as I would. You know, starting with you know, public opinion research. You know, once you educate people with a few facts about the size of the military economy and you know, what else it could do, and you know, the abnormal ways that it protects itself from you know, fulfilling the needs of our citizens. You know, when you give people information, they tend to, you know, at least some, get their minds opened about, you know, what else we could be doing with this money. And, you know, that's the challenge which everybody here is, you know, facing and addressing in one way or another.
Just to, if I can add to that real quick, Lindsay, I think that this is something that Jody brought up a little bit too, is that I do think that we're in a moment. Miriam's been talking about the climate crisis is like a key defining part of this. And something that I think that Jody hinted at a little bit is that, you know, over the past 2 years, I think that there's been a wake-up call for Americans that buying more F-35s hasn't necessarily done anything to make them any safer. And that there's more to our national security policy than just throwing more money at the Pentagon. You know, in the past 2 years, more Americans died from a virus than in all of the wars that we've fought in the 20th and 21st century. And so I do think that there's a lot of political capital there in sort of redefining what American national security entails. And I think that it's important that we sort of use that frame with members of Congress, with leaders, to sort of use this moment to sort of reshape what gets put in under the auspices of this. And frankly, as Miriam and I talked about a little bit earlier, that, you know, the stuff that people cheer for in Top Gun, you know, are all of the old programs. You know, there's something about the movie that I liked is that they show an F-35 for like 2 seconds in the opening scroll, and then the rest of the time they're using planes that were built in the 1980s, you know, and because frankly, those are the last sort of successful military production successes that we have. Looking at the Navy, you know, the last 3 major shipbuilding projects have been absolute duds. You know, 20% of littoral combat ships are never going to leave their home ports. The new generation of aircraft carriers can't even launch and recover F-35s effectively. Like, so we have sort of let the industrial base sort of put the cart before the horse on what it is to keep what it means to keep Americans safe. So I think that there is an opportunity to sort of focus on some of these other issues as national security priorities, and hopefully change some of that rhetoric and some of our political capital on how we go after these issues, or at least that would be my hope.
Thanks, Jeff. And actually, I'm gonna turn to Diana next, and then Jody. If that's all right.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. And I just want to reinforce what Jeff was just saying and Jody referred to before, which is about the need to redefine what security means, and to get people to understand that, I mean, I'm afraid that we've sent the message that all this military spending would be fine if we had enough money, but we just don't have enough money. And so, you know, so there's these trade-offs, and I mean, ultimately, people are willing to spend whatever it takes to feel safe. And as long as they believe that all these weapons and all these facilities and all these interventions are keeping them safe, we're going to have a really hard time cutting this budget. So I think we need to shift to highlighting the harms that this is causing, not just by the trade-offs, but the actual, the killings, the deaths, the toxic waste, the harms to people and to planet, so that people actually see the way that we're approaching national security as something that makes us less safe.
Thanks, Diana. Jody.
Yes, thank you, Diana. I mean, I think that, you know, you mentioned Top Gun and going to the audience. I mean, that was funded by the military, by every branch of the military, because they're not getting recruits. And so it's literally like, you know, manipulating, brainwashing the public into the opposite of what serves them. And, you know, how do we, you know, work locally in these communities? So that's what I was talking about. How do we shift this culture that really has people believing that death, destruction, and oppression is good for life, for the people and the planet? And I really think it's a big piece of how do we together work on this culture piece. And when you watch, you know, that much money being spent on a movie that fries people's brain, and that, you know, it used to be Star Wars that, you know, reminded us that empires are stupid. And now it's Marvel that is just fully funded by the military, militarizing our brains. And each one of us, how do we shift this culture? I mean, COVID helped us remember what's essential and what is necessary for communities. But I think, like you said, Diana, teaching the costs of war, really raising them up. And Lindsay, you know, you're celebrating IPS for all the ways you give us tools as activists to help tell these stories. Deep gratitude.
Thanks, Jody. I also just want to bring out of something all of you talked about, but how do we convince Congress and how do we convince the public are two very different questions. And in fact, the public is already very much with us on a lot of this. We have polling that shows that the public supports cutting Pentagon spending. We know that there's polling and lots of evidence for the fact that people are tired of war in this country. So it's a very different question. How do we convince the public and how do we convince Congress to listen to the public? So I think that's an important distinction. For our next audience question from Robert Sharetta, do we have a clear picture of just how large a share of the US economy is driven by military spending, intelligence spending, base operations, et cetera? And we've already dedicated $54 billion to Ukraine aid. That is not all military, but yes. How many US domestic programs are still going begging? Miriam,
I think,
start with you.
Well, I think you are the best person to answer that question. You work on that, those you know, sorts of trade-offs, you know, all the time. So I want to hear from you on that one.
But I wasn't trying to set myself up for that, but I'll go ahead. I'll go ahead and give it a shot. So what share of the economy? So one measure, you know, people talk about a lot is the share of GDP that military spending is. And in the US right now, it's a little shy of 4%. In a lot of other countries, for example, you see a lot of NATO countries right now starting to ramp up their military spending. The target for a long time for a lot of them has been 2% of their GDP. So the US, by that and many, many other measures, has a huge part of our economy dedicated to this. But then on I think the part about it, the domestic programs, basically all of them are going begging, right? So right now, for instance, and I see Rob has his hand up, so maybe he'll talk about this, but right now there's a resolution in Congress to cut $100 billion from the Pentagon budget. And we did some analysis of what else that money could pay for. And what we found is that among the things that we could do with that money, you could have covered the clean energy and childcare provisions of Biden's earlier Build Back Better initiative, the one that died in December. The childcare part of that has been left completely in the dust, didn't happen at all. You could power every household in the United States with solar energy, every single household. Or you could hire 1 million elementary school teachers for the teacher shortage that right now is going on all over the country, and that is mostly being dealt with on a local and state level. So it's all of the programs. And Miriam, of course, focuses on climate. That is an especially big area because it's something where we need so much investment. But there are many, many answers to that question, and those are just a few of them. I'm going to turn to Rob next.
Thanks, everybody. I just wanted to sort of connect this question and the prior one. And, sort of, there is a question about this redefining national security, but also just, it doesn't necessarily be national security. It can be sort of redefining priorities, which is, actually even the name of your project, Lindsay. I think what's so distinctive and what's our big challenge is if you contrast the kind of thinking that you articulate in the book, Miriam, and that Diana, you were just describing, to protect the country, whatever it takes. To protect the country, whatever it takes. And people mean it. Joe Manchin supports whatever it takes to spend on the military, is defined as whatever the Pentagon plus the contractors on top of them want. We don't have to offset, we don't have to deficit spend, we don't have to find ways for the money, we don't have to sort of a dollar in for deficit, we don't have to raise taxes for it, nothing, whatever it takes. But if we want to reduce child poverty through proven tools, or expand healthcare, or give dental coverage to seniors, or deal with the climate, or protect consumers, or worker rights, or raise the minimum wage, or the salary of government workers, or anything else, the long list of priorities and many more that Lindsay was highlighting. We don't have the same attitude. It's not whatever it takes. We're budget constrained. We need $1 to raise to offset. And sometimes if you're Joe Manchin, we don't just $1 to raise to pay for it. We have to also pay down the deficit. So there's just completely asymmetric framework for how we think about our supposed priorities. And to me, there's just a lot of layers. It's obviously taking a military industrial complex work of a lifetime. But one piece of this overall conversion is converting the way we think about the challenges we face. And for us, it's easier actually at the macro level than trying to be in the communities that Miriam profiles, where the deck is so stacked against us. To insist on actually the things that are social priorities or human priorities, those are actual priorities, and we have to mean it, and we need our governmental representatives to mean it at least as much as they supposedly or allegedly mean when it comes to purported external military threats. And we just have to shift that framework. And I think, that's a big part of the story in terms of disciplining on the military side, as well as talking about the harms, of course, but also talking up and building the case for whether it's climate industrial policy or social investments or anything else. One last thing, just in this space to highlight how severe these disparities are and how messed up our thinking is. But I think we're in it, right? So it's hard, and we all know it's irrational, upside down, and Alice in Wonderland. But I think sometimes it's actually even worse than we perceive. So with the global COVID pandemic, something a lot of us have worked on, and we've worked on a lot of public citizen. It would have been possible to scale up production of vaccines to supply the entire world and deliver to the entire world. We calculated at $25 billion. So maybe we were wrong. Maybe it was $35 or $40 billion, but we weren't more wrong than that. I think we were actually right, but whatever. Okay, that's the amount that the Congress has now so far proposed to increase the military budget beyond what the Defense Department itself says it wants. But we got no traction for that, right? So it is really an Alice in Wonderland thing, and we just got to find both the political power, but also like the imagination and the language to reorient how these policy discussions go. To me, that's a big part of this story, on top of actually having the plans themselves. It's like just reframing how people are thinking, people, both the public, but also forcing it on the indentured members of Congress.
Thanks, Rob. Jeff.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and especially what Rob brings up here, that we hold the military to a different standard. Like I was saying, like so many of the weapons programs that we've produced since 9/11 have been absolute duds and have done nothing to actually make any American any safer. They've provided a lot of jobs that's 100% accurate. But I think that one of my favorite things is a new program, the B-21 bomber, the Air Force's new strategic air power thing. They decided that they were going to crowdsource the name for it, right, amongst airmen, and which led to hilarity, as I'm sure everybody can assume. But my favorite name that came out of it was A Million Schools. Like this program could easily go and pay for 1 million schools, and said, I love whoever that airman was that wrote that in. I think we look at nuclear weapons spending, over the next 30 years, we're going to spend $2 trillion on recapitalizing the nuclear weapons arsenal in this country. And like Miriam said, just 20 years ago, these were things that people didn't think we needed anymore, right? And now, that's all of student debt in this country, like all of it. Biden's, having a tough time trying to sell a $10,000 forgiveness to every person that has federal student debt. Nuclear weapons alone, this tiny pot of money, would be all of that. And I think that we have this massive problem here, and exactly what Miriam is talking about, that there's a problem with political will, and like what Rob is saying, that we hold these programs to a different standard, that I think is a lot to do with sort of parochial interests, and sort of, like Miriam saying, that Lockheed Martin bases these in so many constituencies and so many communities, that even when they fail, they're almost too big to fail. And this isn't going to change. I mean, people are talking about these amendments that are on the NDA right now, to even just cut the extra $37 billion that the Pentagon didn't say it needed, but that got tacked onto this bill anyways. That amendment failed, right? And until we're willing to stop just printing more money for every single idea that the defense industrial base or the Pentagon has, we're gonna have a real problem in making any headway here. And I think that we need to, for people that were interested in politics, need to really find some champions, especially on the Senate side, to make this more of an issue, to make this more of a problem, that we have to be able to hold these programs accountable when they don't work. And I think that's something that should work. People are going to say it's naive, but that's something that should work. People used to care about fiscal responsibility in this country. They used to care about, that these programs would work or not. I think that we need to make that sort of a key political issue again.
Thanks, Jeff. And Miriam again. Miriam, you're muted.
How do I unmute?
You're good.
Okay.
We hear you. Yes.
To Jeff's point on members of Congress and finding champions, it occurred to me, maybe this has already been done, I don't know. So we know that some members of Congress, vote, we know who they are, who vote to restrain military spending in one way or another. And most of those people we know and or can assume don't have much military stuff in their districts. But I wonder if somebody could do the analysis to look at, you know, those two things and find a few people who are, you know, have substantial military production in their districts, and yet vote to cut military spending, and kind of lift them up as the you know, the profiles in courage or something. I think there are going to be some. So in the state of Connecticut, in the Senate, both of their senators are are progressives, and you know, they have made a few votes to, you know, cut military spending by 10%, probably in cases where they knew it wasn't going to pass, and they knew it wasn't, you know, that important, and they're not coming up for re-election, and all these different reasons why it's okay for them to do it. And then they, you know, celebrate the acceleration of the latest Columbia class submarine program, because they, you know, that's the way the game is played. But, you know, it seems to me that there are some other, but, you know, and they're much bigger champions. Their hearts are in it, I think, you know, building a real green economy in the state of Connecticut. But it seems like if you did that analysis, you'd find some members, some that maybe you didn't know about before, who, you know, do vote to restrain military spending and have substantial military projects in their districts, and then lift them up as, you know, champions of honor.
Thanks, Miriam. We only have 4 minutes left, and I see we have a couple of panelists. So what I'm going to propose is that we will go to each panelist, and you'll have a chance to say final words, including whatever your response is to that question. And I just want to urge people again to buy the book, read the book. It is, as Rob said, it is lively and engaging. And if you ever wanted to, you know, go to one of these places and talk to a worker, or talk to a union leader, or talk to a business owner who is wrapped up in this, that's what this book does. And those voices come through so clearly, and it's very engaging, it's very well written, and it really gives you a sense of what's actually happening in these communities and what it might take to move us past it. So I'll go to Diana first for both a response and closing remarks.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. And thanks again, Miriam, for a terrific book and a wonderful opportunity to discuss it. I just wanted to weigh in on the last issue you were discussing, which is getting Congress to vote. And I, you know, as a registered lobbyist and as somebody who worked on Capitol Hill for many, many years, for the most part, members of Congress do what their constituents want them to do and ask them to do. And if they're hearing from thousands of their constituents asking them to cut the defense budget, they're going to do that. The problem is that we put way too much emphasis on polling and public polling. And it does not matter at all what people say to a pollster. What matters is what they say to their member of Congress. And if they don't care enough about an issue to get active and to be heard about it, it's not going to impact what Congress does. So getting people to believe that Congress has the power to make change, that it's not so completely dysfunctional that it's not worth talking to them, that's a big hurdle to get over. But if we can get people to believe that Congress can make a change and let them know what they think, we have a chance of making a change.
Thanks, Diana. And Jeff.
Yeah, just, go off that. I think Diana is absolutely right. People, vote with their feet. And I think that grassroots organizations play an incredibly powerful role in this, and making sure the constituents are heard. If I can just give a quick plug for my former organization, the Council for a Livable World, they endorse candidates and raise money for candidates based along these issues, that the exact things that Miriam are talking about, people that are willing to take a stand on these issues. So I hope that folks will go check out the Council for a Livable World's website. And I think that this is more and more and more, you know, as we continue to see Department of Defense budgets rise, I think that this is going to have to become a, you know, sort of political place where we're all willing to take action. And I think that this is more timely than ever right now, especially as we continue to see more and more things sort of edge into that question about what is necessary to make America a safer place.
Thanks, Jeff. And Jody.
So just thank you, IPS and Miriam and Lindsay, for all you do to give us the tools to do what Jeff and Diane have said, that it is a movement that we need to build, and Congress acts from the movement, and that takes education, because they're fed every day, they're brainwashed every day that war is the answer. And we know war is never the answer. And it's up to us to stand for that. I mean, to really stand for that in whatever room we are in, to use these tools that we've been given to share, because people, when they don't feel secure about something, won't talk about it. And we need to get more people to feel secure in war is never the answer, that it costs my life. It literally costs my life and the future for my children. And it's up to each one of us to be that activist and build that movement that we need to shift this. So thank you. And Miriam, Code Pink's here for you. Whenever you're going somewhere, please let us know. Our audience is there and wants to hear from you.
Thanks, Jody. And well, we're a little tiny touch over time, but we'll do Rob, and then Miriam gets the final word.
Thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks for IPS for convening us. And thank you, Miriam, for sharing this beautiful book with us. That's it, Lindsay.
Miriam, you're muted again.
Hello.
That's perfect.
Anyway, it's been such an honor to do this, and I am so honored by the people who have been with us in this conversation and those who are listening. And you know, it's been the honor of my life to work in this space with all of you and to do this book. It was an odd passion, but I did get to the end of it. And I really hope it becomes some sort of resource for this movement that we all need.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for being here today. Thanks to all of our co-sponsor organizations and our panelists and the audience for so many good questions, many of which we didn't get to. But buy the book and continue to follow Miriam's work, because it's really special. Thanks.